Hello, my name's Nathan Jacobsen. This is our presentation for the ECON 495 final project. The topic that we chose is childhood education success and the impact that this has on poverty levels in the United States. Education and poverty are important issues in the United States. This is a topic that has caught the attention of political and business leaders and really the public at large. To climb out of poverty, you need a stable job, and a big part of that is your educational level. Elementary education is crucial in cognitive development in children and later success in the workforce. Our data shows that the highest indicators of poverty among education variables are high school graduation rate. And we do have some limitations in this study. This does just isolate two educational variables and does not include other variables that might impact poverty. And our policy recommendation will be discussed at the end. As we narrowed down the topic of our project, finding the data to analyze proved to be a little bit tricky. And what we landed on was the impact of education on poverty levels in the United States. This was an important topic for us because all three of our group members have children, and we all want to have high quality education for our kids. We understand that poverty is a huge issue in the United States, and we want to understand what impact education has on those poverty levels. So some questions that we wondered: do early pre-K programs have any impact on poverty levels? That's obviously early in the child's educational career. Does that mean more to poverty levels, if at all, than fourth grade, eighth grade, high school? Is there a link between poverty and education in the U.S.? And if so, is this consistent across the U.S., or is it just part of a specific region in the United States? So this will be organized into 6 different sections. We're going to introduce the literature, talk about why this is an issue, talk about our statistics, and go into our empirical results, and make a conclusion and policy recommendation after that. So the research on this is vast. What we found is that there are many economic studies that have been done to show the impact of education on long-term adult outcomes, such as crime, income, employment, health, overall wealth. And while there's been significant research and commentary on the impacts of overall adult education, the educational outcomes of children showed some startling results. Research has explored disparities based on sociodemographic risk factors at earlier ages, and this has indicated that there is a disparity in cognitive development that's evident as early as 24 months of age, with a few studies documenting development disparities based on sociodemographic risk within the first year of life. So these children are being impacted by poverty in a big way. The United States doesn't provide universal access to public preschool programs, despite numerous studies demonstrating the long-term individual and societal benefits of early learning. Now, although there's no national pre-K universal access, there are many states that have very high levels of enrollment in pre-K programs. And even though some states limit funding in these areas, there are a few states which have zero funds allocated for this, leaving these 4-year-old children in those states with no public preschool options. Now, the access to quality education is critical for cognitive development and is important to long-term success economically. Children in poverty are less likely to have the early educational support that would help them develop critical thinking skills. Their parents are typically less educated, have a fewer financial resources to purchase things like educational toys, books, and other resources to support their child's learning and development. Now, those in poverty have less stable employment and tend to work more hours. This leaves less time for their children, less time to ask questions and help them with their homework. And this definitely does have an impact. It's widely agreed among most Americans that work is the most effective way to climb out of poverty and improve overall economic success. However, living in poverty has the greatest impact on the children in low-income households. These children are going to grow into adulthood with limited resources and the ability to learn and develop. They have less opportunity for quality education, which therefore impacts their ability to secure a steady job. Many jobs that they'd be qualified for have fluctuating wages, instability, and lower consistency in hours worked. So we want to know, do early pre-K programs have an influence on poverty levels? When these educational outcomes are positive, does it improve poverty? And we're going to discuss that in the next slide. So the models that we want to use are a multivariable linear regression model. We pulled data from 2019 census records for the poverty rate and the state spending variables, and we used the U.S. News and World Report high school graduation rates and the national testing for reading scores. And we chose to have our dependent variable as the poverty rate per state, and our independent variables are child enrollment in pre-K programs, spending on the pre-K programs, 4th and 8th grade reading scores, and high school graduation rates. Now we want to see if this is consistent across the country. So we did control for regional characteristics, splitting the country up into 4 regions: Northeast, Midwest, South, and West. So here's the table of expected signs and variables. We want to know, what is our expected sign? What is our assumption of the data? We start with enrollment rates of pre-K students, where we assume that as higher rates of student involvement in these programs occur, the long-term effect of that is poverty rates are going to decrease. Now, this follows along with research that suggests children who live in poverty have higher rates of school unreadiness, which is a big factor that can continue to impact students through their education career as they fall behind their peers. By seeing students with higher levels of enrollment rates into pre-K programs, their school readiness potential will likely increase. And this idea is that, it's a first step. It's a first step to continue to help these students succeed through their school careers. Now we move on to state spending per child in pre-K programs. We assume that if states spend more money, then they're going to have better success. They'll have better staffed pre-K programs and support, and these poverty rates are going to decrease as a result. Our prediction is that the funding in the higher states are going to show lower rates of poverty. Test scores are next, measured at both the 4th grade and the 8th grade levels to determine whether or not poverty rates are affected as student literacy scores improve as they age. Literacy rates are often factors used for both children and adults when measuring poverty rates in a population. And it's our prediction that as scores increase, poverty rates are going to steadily decline. And at present, these two variables are assumed to have the greatest impact on poverty rates before we run the data. And our last variable is going to be analyzing the high school graduation rates among the different states. Those students are probably going to have a really significant impact on poverty rates because they're about to enter the workforce. So it's a little bit easier to measure directly what that impact will be. So it's our prediction that as graduation rates increase for a population, the poverty rates for that same population are going to decrease. And while all of these variables can't account for environmental and economical determinants of poverty, we do believe that these 5 categories are going to show statistically significant correlation between education rates and poverty in the United States. All right, so next we're going to break down the data and use some descriptive statistics to narrow this down. What is the impact on poverty? So here we have the data set, and this shows our dependent variable is the percentage of the state population experiencing poverty. We find that the nationwide mean poverty value of 12.1% is significantly lower than the maximum percentage of poverty found in Mississippi of 19%. Alternatively, this average is much higher, less significantly than that of the higher value difference, but just the same. It's higher than the low end of the percentage range, which is 7% poverty that's experienced in New Hampshire. And with the standard deviation of 2.6% in this data set, it can be noted that the most of the individual poverty rates in these states have a small variation from the nationwide mean value. When evaluating the independent variable of the total number of children enrolled, the data, it varies significantly. In this, we see a mean of 31,000 in a standard deviation of roughly 52,000, and there's a wide gap of the max and the min, and a big result of that is California at 238,000 and zero. There's a few states, Indiana, Montana, New Hampshire, South Dakota, and Wyoming, that do not fund their pre-K program. So it's important to note that there's no national standards governing childcare for preschool age children, and state laws and oversight, they vary widely. So this makes it a variable that is kind of tricky. It's a potential limitation of our study, and we're going to outline that later on in our conclusion. Another independent variable is 4th grade and 8th grade reading scores. These are fairly close to each other, with 4th grade reading scores ranging from 204 to 231, and 8th grade reading scores ranging from 250 to 273. The standard deviation and the mean for these, they seem in line that, this is one of the most important factors in educational outcomes impacting poverty. So most of the test scores were distributed near the mean value, and that's in both the 4th grade and the 8th grade. Now, the reason this is significant is as children are in a crucial part of cognitive development in the 4th grade and the 8th grade, it often indicates how successful they're going to be as they grow and advance through the grades. Now, the next independent variable that we measured was high school graduation rate. This is a significant variable for us because this is the variable where people are about to enter the workforce. So that's important because of that. What we find is that 87% of the country are graduating, and that's a standard deviation of 4.5%, which shows that the majority of high school graduation rates are fairly close to the mean value. And as the previous data sets also had similar trends in regard to clustering, a more in-depth look at the way these factors impact poverty is needed. All right, so to further analyze the data on poverty, we want to look at some scatter plots. The scatter plots are going to visually show us the correlation of poverty levels and educational outcomes. So our scatter plots support our intuitive prediction that we used in the initial data in pre-K enrollment. There's a weak positive correlation with a small number of outliers here. The outliers are still uniform and consistent with poverty, but this is the weakest correlation of all the variables that we analyzed. The next scatter plot is state spending. There's less clustering than the other models and a higher number of outliers here, which shows a weak positive correlation and trend line. Thus, state spending is a poor predictor of poverty rates. Now this one's important. Test scores with 4th grade and 8th grade students. As we mentioned earlier, the 4th grade students and the 8th grade students, these are significant milestones in their educational career. So gauging whether their reading test scores are positive or not, that definitely impacts their overall educational process. What we found is that both scatter plots show similar results, with the data points following closely along the trend line, and there's few outliers or deviation showing similar moderately strong negative correlations. What this tells us is that as reading scores increase at both of these levels, poverty levels are noticeably going to decrease at similar rates. So these scatter plots are important because this shows us this is the most significant impact. High school graduation rates has a slight negative correlation between the two variables, small amount of outliers, and most points follow the correlation and lay close to the trend line. So this does support our hypothesis that higher education success does lead to lower poverty. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is our empirical results. Empirically, we're presenting 6 different models for our regression to explore the significance of the coefficients. Our first model is a reduced model without the regional variables being considered. And our second model, we're going to include all of them, including Northeast, Midwest, South, and West. And then the last 4 models we want to use to explain the regional variables. We explain the coefficients and the significance of each of these models using the p-value to test for overall significance, and to gauge for initial statistical significance in a regression model, the p-value must register less than 0.05. After running these models, here's the results. The adjusted R-squared for our reduced model is 0.37, which means this variable is going to account for roughly 37% of the dependent variable's variance, a rate that's lower than the full model and suggests that it would predict the occurrence of poverty against these variables with less accurate results. The reduced model has a smaller correlation coefficient return at 66% correlation between the variables versus 74% with the full model, as well as a higher standard error at 2.13 versus 1.94 for the full model. What this tells us is that the full model has a better goodness of fit measure than the reduced model. So the overall assessment of our empirical results, when we look at the signs of the coefficients in the full model, we find that of the variables being measured, reading scores at both the 4th grade level and the 8th grade level have coefficients with the most impact upon the model at -0.25 and -0.08 respectively. And what this tells us is that as reading scores increase for both 4th grade and 8th graders, poverty percentage will decrease at a constant rate. And the other variables being tested inside this model would also suggest that as their values increase, poverty rates are going to decrease as predicted by the previously discussed coefficient table. The amounts by which they're able to reduce poverty rates return much lower values. And this is consistent with the finding from research that indicates literacy rates have a direct impact on poverty. And we did run the models to test for regional effect in order to determine if educational values in the region of the United States, the 4 different regions, showed more or less impact on poverty rates. And what we found is that the differences were negligible at best. So we didn't do any further analysis of these models because for reference, it doesn't make a huge difference on the outcome of our study. So in conclusion, the purpose of the study was to determine how education impacts poverty rates in the United States. The key findings of our study is that the largest impact on poverty is 4th and 8th grade reading levels. Our policy recommendation based on these results is to standardize pre-K education, increase funding across the country for education, and implement improved and increased funding for safety net programs among low-income households to mitigate the impact of poverty. Some limitations and possible extensions of our study: the state laws, they vary, the funding varies, and oversight varies on pre-K. So that's going to change across each state. And our data omits important potential forerunners to poverty, such as race, higher education completion, marital status, access to quality health care. These are all important things to measure poverty as well, and we did not include this in our study. So when we are conducting this study, we're only talking about the educational outcomes and not other impacts that could have a play on poverty. And here we have our references that we used as we researched this topic. And our data sources are right here. This concludes our presentation on the impact that educational outcomes in children have on poverty.